Back in the autumn of 1870, when the hedgerows burned gold and secrets moved quieter than scandal, there was a manor outside Sussex with 3 floors, 42 windows, and one name carved in stone, Wetherby Hall. Not hers, not yet. They said Mr. Jameson Wetherby was a man of fine taste and private vows. He liked his wine French, his boots polished, and his mistakes discreet. But this story is not about his estate or his horses or even his legacy. This story is about Marion Clark, the woman he married in secret, the woman who stood outside the gates on the day of his funeral, uninvited, unacknowledged, and far from finished. It was the kind of mourning England keeps for grief. Fog clung to the ground like a second skin, softening the sharp edges of hedgerows and muting the shine of the wrought iron gates. Wetherby Hall sat in the distance like a secret, its windows glinting gold from candlelight within, too warm for mourning. Marion Clark stood just outside the gate, gloved hands folded neatly over a black velvet reticule, a dark veil pinned beneath her hat. Her coat was wool, too fine for a common widow, and her boots were polished to a dull, disciplined shine. She had walked the last half-mile, not because she couldn't afford a carriage, because she wanted the quiet before they saw her, because she wanted to feel the ground he once rode across, under her own feet. Behind her, crows flapped from the yew trees like the sky was ashamed to watch. Ahead of her, the gates remained closed. Inside, the funeral had begun. Not the ceremony, no, not yet, but the part where they gathered in drawing rooms, speaking in low tones, sipping sherry they didn't like, wondering which cousin would inherit the stables, and whether the widow, the real one, would faint. She was not inside. Marion was not on the list, because according to the solicitor, the family, the world, she did not exist. She reached into her reticule and pulled out the paper again. Folded 6 times, edges softened from hours of opening and closing. Marriage certificate, Jameson Wetherby, Marion Clark, dated 17th April 1869. Signed by a chapel priest with poor penmanship. Stamped by a registrar in London. Witnessed by no one she knew. They had wed in a side street chapel where the bells didn't ring. She still wore the ring beneath her glove. Thin, gold, and slightly crooked. He'd bought it off a merchant too drunk to haggle. "I don't believe in diamonds," he'd said, pressing it to her palm. "I believe in quiet promises." She had smiled then, fool that she was. A carriage passed along the gravel road behind her, its wheels cracking the silence. A few men inside glanced toward her. One in a cravat nudged the other and whispered. She kept her back straight, head tilted just so. They didn't recognize her. Of course not. He had kept her in London, in a rented flat above a bookbinder's. Said it was cleaner than Sussex. Said country air made him dull. Said he'd bring her to the estate once the timing was right. The timing had died with him, and now... The gates did not open. The butler, Wetherby's man, Harris, stood just inside, spine straight, hands clasped behind his back. He did not move toward her, did not nod. She had once poured him a cup of tea when he'd visited Jameson in the city. He'd complimented her lemon curd, called her Miss Clark, with just the faintest lilt. Now he looked past her like she was weather. The fog crept higher. Damp curled beneath her hem. Inside, the church bells rang. Marion did not flinch, but she did tighten her grip on the reticule. Inside it, beneath the folded paper, lay a letter. The last he ever wrote her. The ink was rushed, the signature smudged, but she had memorized every word. "If anything happens, go to Wetherby. Show them the paper. Harris knows. He won't refuse you." He had lied, or died too soon to make the truth strong enough. Behind her, the hedgerows rustled. To her left, a coachman cleared his throat, loud enough to be heard, not enough to be courteous. Still Marion stood. She would not knock. She would not call out. She would not beg to be let in. She had been his wife. She was still. The bell tolled once more. Inside the gates of Wetherby, the funeral began. Outside them, Marion Clark, Mrs. Marion Wetherby, did not cry. She adjusted her gloves, stepped back from the gate, and turned, just slowly enough that Harris would have to keep watching her leave. The walk back to the village was short, but it felt longer with every step. Marion didn't rush. She kept her pace steady, even as the wind tugged at her veil and the wet road soaked through the soles of her boots. The funeral bell faded behind her, but its echo stayed in her chest like a bruise. She passed the post office, the butcher's, a row of cottages with tired windows and shutters that didn't quite close. A woman peered out, recognized her black coat, then ducked quickly out of view. It wasn't a big village, and news traveled faster than any letter. At the end of the high street, tucked between a milliner and a grocer, sat a narrow building with a faded green sign. Bell and Son Booksellers. The paint had peeled, the windows fogged over in the corners, but inside was warmth. And right now Marian needed warmth more than pride. She stepped inside. A bell above the door gave a soft ring, less a welcome than a notice. The shop smelled like old paper and wood polish. Not perfumed, not sweet, just clean and steady, like something that didn't pretend to be more than it was. Shelves lined the walls, each one filled not with perfect rows but slightly crooked spines. Books were stacked in piles by subject: travel, gardening, poetry. A threadbare rug softened the floorboards, and in the corner a coal stove crackled quietly. Behind the counter stood a man, older than Marian, perhaps mid-30s, thin with rolled shirt sleeves and a brown waistcoat. His spectacles hung low on his nose. He looked up at the sound of the bell, then paused when he saw her. Not stared, just paused. "Good morning," he said gently. She nodded once. "May I sit a moment?" He gestured to a chair by the stove. "Of course, you're welcome." No questions, no assumptions. She sat. The heat from the stove reached her slowly, first at her ankles, then up through the damp fabric of her skirt. She didn't take off her gloves, but she did remove her hat, setting it gently in her lap. Her hair was slightly flattened, the curl at her temples clinging to her skin. She ran a gloved finger along her cheek, checking for tears she hadn't allowed. None. The shopkeeper moved quietly around her, rearranging books, tending to the stove, not ignoring her, just giving her space the way someone might give a wounded animal the chance to stay or leave on its own. Finally, she opened the reticule. The letter was there, creased, careful. She unfolded it slowly, letting the paper crackle. Her hands were steady now. They had practice. "If anything happens, go to Weatherby. Show them the paper. Harris knows. He won't refuse you." His writing had always slanted slightly left. But this was messier. The ink blotched near the bottom. The paper smelled faintly of pipe smoke and dust. She read it again, then again. There were only 3 lines, not even a full goodbye. She had always assumed there'd be more, some closing words, a reason, a will, but there was nothing, no mention of his illness, no final date, and no instructions for what to do after she wasn't let in. "May I?" the shopkeeper asked suddenly. She looked up. He held out a porcelain cup. Tea, no saucer, no lemon, just simple and hot. Marian hesitated, then took it. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. "Bell, Ezra Bell." She gave no name. He didn't ask for one. The tea warmed her throat, a plain blend, black and a little bitter, but it made her hands feel less like stone. "New to the village?" he asked. "Yes. You're welcome to wait out the weather here." Marian looked out the window. It wasn't raining. She met his eyes again. They were steady, pale brown, and unbothered by silence. "Thank you," she said again. He returned to the counter and opened a ledger. She read the letter again, still 3 lines, still no answers, and yet something began to twist in her chest. Not grief, not yet. Suspicion. Jameson had always been careful, about names, about letters, about leaving evidence. So why this? Why leave her a letter Harris had ignored? Why mention no other details? No dates, no accounts, no lawyer? She looked down at the paper, then at the seal on the envelope. It had been torn before she received it. She hadn't noticed that before. Something had been opened, and possibly removed. Ezra looked up from his ledger and caught her staring at the letter. "Bad news?" he asked gently. She folded the paper again, slid it back into her reticule. "Not yet," she said, but she was beginning to think it would be. The bell above the bookshop didn't chime when she left. Ezra had returned to his ledger. The stove hissed low, and Marian, gloves back on, reticule clutched too tight, stepped out into a world she hadn't decided to rejoin yet. The street was louder than before. Children shrieked near a sweets cart. Vendors called out for penny purchases. A constable tried to calm a growing crowd near the corner where cobbles turned to carriage track. Marion walked, but not with purpose. Her feet moved because her heart didn't know what else to do. She wasn't going back to the little house tonight, not yet. She wasn't going to a boarding room. She didn't have enough coin for one anyway. England stretched behind her, miles and miles of train tracks and towns she'd once dared to call home. She had no job, no husband, no invitation, only a marriage certificate that meant less than ash. The crowd thickened ahead, people murmuring, women craning their necks, men laughing low. Someone whistled. Marion's brow furrowed as she followed their gazes, not because she cared, but because it was easier than thinking. A carriage sat askew in the street, its left front wheel broken clean at the axle. A white liveried footman bent to inspect the damage. A groom tried to calm the horses, but the faces in the crowd weren't looking at the wheel. They were watching the woman stepping out of the carriage, helped by a man in a fine coat. She was smiling, giddy even, hair in elegant curls pinned with garnets, gloves ivory, her laughter high, unbothered. She whispered something to the man beside her. Harris, Marion realized, then kissed him lightly on the cheek as he bent to fix her skirts. A hush went through the crowd, not because of impropriety, but because wealth protects scandal and beauty excuses affection. Marion stared. That face, that woman, her husband's sister, the same face framed in an oval gilt frame above the fireplace at the apartment Jameson kept for her. The woman he once said ran the family truly, but never visited, never wrote, never called Marion by name. And that carriage, gold trim, the Weatherby crest on the door, the same one Jameson arrived in the day he told Marion she deserved a place better suited for her nature. The carriage she hadn't ridden in since he left. Now it belonged to his sister, and Harris. Marion's thoughts went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence where the air stops moving, where every voice becomes a dull echo in a far-off tunnel, where everything tilts sideways, and you realize the story you were told is not the one you were living. The kiss, the way he touched her waist like habit, not courtesy, the laughter. They had planned this. They had written the letter, shut her out, erased her. Marion turned. Her breath came uneven. She bumped into a man with a pipe who cursed, nearly knocked over a boy chasing a hoop. She didn't hear them, didn't see the carriage coming from the other direction. Fast, dark, heavy. She stepped off the curb, a scream, a whistle, and then an arm around her waist, yanking her back so hard her heels scraped the cobbles. A voice in her ear. Easy now. Ezra, breathless, alarmed, still holding her. The carriage whooshed past, driver shouting something furious, wheels slick with mud and missed impact. Marion blinked, dazed. Ezra's hand was still on her waist. The other cupped her elbow gently. His face was too close, his voice too steady. You weren't watching, he said. She shook her head. I wasn't anywhere. He didn't ask what she saw, didn't ask why she walked like a ghost, didn't scold or analyze. He just said, "Come with me." She opened her mouth, closed it, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she didn't argue. Room above the shop's empty, he said. It's warm, clean, bit of a draft near the window, but the floorboards don't squeak after dark. She stared at it. I can pay, she said. I won't refuse it, he replied, but I'm not asking for it. Marion didn't take the key right away. She just looked at it, small, plain. It had weight, but not pressure. Why? She asked. Ezra studied her then, not like a man with questions, like a man who had already answered his own. Because you look like someone who's had every door closed on her. I thought maybe one ought to open. The silence after that wasn't heavy, it was full. Marion reached forward, took the key, and tucked it into her coat pocket without looking down. My name, she said quietly, is Marion Weatherby. Legally, though no one at that funeral would admit it. Marion returned to Weatherby Hall the next morning. Not from down the lane this time, but from the early train, her coat still smelling faintly of old books and hearth smoke from Ezra's flat above the shop. The ride had been long, quiet. A single passenger car rattling through half-lit villages and frost-touched farmland. She hadn't slept. just stared out the window, clutching a small paper parcel of toast she never touched. Now, standing at the iron gates once more, Marion's boots were the same. So was the long coat, but something in her face had settled. She did not flinch. The fog had lifted, but the sky above Weatherby was still the color of old bone. The air was sharp enough to sting if you breathed too deeply. This time, Harris opened the gate. Just one side. Just far enough to step through, not be welcomed. He didn't greet her, didn't bow, didn't even look surprised. Only stepped back like a servant allowing a storm to pass through the doorframe and hoping not to get wet. Harris blinked once. He was careful, she said. Even his secrets were neatly folded. Still, he said nothing. So she tilted her head, just slightly. When did he fall ill, Harris? That made him shift. A twitch in his neck, a flicker in his gaze toward the gravel path behind her. He took sick the week after Whitsun, Harris said finally. That was 2 months before the letter. Marion narrowed her eyes. And did he leave Sussex in that time? No. Her voice dropped. So how did he write me from London? Harris swallowed. She saw it now, something flickering behind the eyes. Not shock, not cruelty, just fear. Did he write it at all? She asked. Harris didn't answer, but his silence was louder than words. Marion turned then. Not angry, not broken, just decided. She adjusted her gloves and stepped back outside the gate. No thank you, no farewell. Just the truth clutched tight inside her ribs like a splinter. The bell above the bookshop door gave a softer chime that day. Ezra looked up from his counter, spectacles perched low on his nose, and didn't ask where she'd been. He simply nodded toward the stove and said, "The chair's still yours if you need it." Marion stepped inside without a word. Her boots were still wet. The hem of her coat carried the weight of morning dew and old soil from Weatherby's path, but her posture had changed, no longer stiff with shame, just steady. She removed her gloves slowly, folding them at the seams. Then her hat, then finally sat, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath for days. Ezra moved without fuss, filling the kettle, brushing a bit of ash from the stove's lip. "Do you keep many secrets in here?" she asked suddenly, voice calm. He looked over his shoulder. "Books or people?" "Both." He smiled faintly. "Neither if I can help it, but I don't chase them out either." She nodded once. "Good." The kettle hissed low. The smell of steeping tea curled into the air, plain again, black and strong. But this time Marion took it in both hands and drank. Ezra returned to his spot behind the counter, but leaned a little closer, elbows resting near the ledger. "You're not passing through, are you?" he asked. Marion shook her head. "Not anymore." He reached behind him, fumbled briefly, then held out a simple brass key. "Room upstairs is still empty," Ezra said. "It's warm, clean, bit of a draft near the window, but the floorboards don't squeak after dark." Marion didn't answer right away. She was still holding the chipped teacup he'd handed her hours ago. The tea had gone cold, but her fingers hadn't moved. She glanced toward the stairs, not like she was measuring distance, but consequence. "I can pay," she said finally. Ezra's reply was steady. "I won't refuse it, but I'm not asking for it." She stared at the key he held out. Small, plain. It had weight, but not pressure. "Why?" He looked at her then. Not like a man waiting for something in return. Not like a man doing a favor. Just steady, like someone who'd already made peace with the choice. "Because you look like someone who's had every door closed on her," he said quietly. "I thought maybe one ought to open." His silence that followed wasn't awkward. It wasn't even sad. It was full, like breath before a confession. Marion reached out, took the key, and tucked it into her coat pocket without looking down. "My name," she said softly, "is Marion Weatherby, legally, though no one at that funeral would admit it." Ezra didn't flinch. "Good to meet you properly, Mrs. Weatherby," he said, voice low. Her lips curved, not fully, not sweetly, but like someone finding a piece of herself exactly where she'd left it. Ezra leaned on the counter, more casual now. "If you'd like to keep your hands busy," he added, "I could use someone to help rewrap the ledgers, maybe label the teas, bake if it's in you, No pressure. Marion blinked once, then nodded. I don't need charity. I don't offer it, he said. Just work and a room that doesn't talk back. She gave the smallest laugh, and that was how it began. 8 months had passed since Marion first tucked the key into her pocket and climbed the narrow stairs. What began as refuge had slowly become rhythm. The room above Ezra's shop was still small, still drafty near the window, but Marion no longer noticed the chill. She knew which floorboard groaned when she stepped wrong, which hinge on the cupboard always caught, knew the way the early sun fell across the quilt she'd mended with scraps from his torn bookcloth. Ezra had fixed the broken stove himself back in January, said he didn't like the way her hands shook when she brewed tea too close to the cold. He never hovered, never asked questions, but somehow there was always fresh bread waiting in the mornings and a new tin of tea just when hers ran low. She'd taken to baking pies for the shop, apple mostly, and blackberry when she could get it cheap. Customers started coming in for them. He added a second chair near the front and called it the Pie Nook, with a little painted sign she made herself. By spring, Ezra built a second shelf of books for the window display, and by summer they were making enough to justify adding a second table. They didn't talk about the past much, but sometimes, in the evenings, when the bell had stopped ringing and the kettle had gone quiet, they sat on the back step with their mugs and let the silence stretch between them like something sacred. He never touched her, never tried. But sometimes, when he was shelving books or wiping down the counter, Marion would glance at him and wonder how much longer she could pretend not to notice the way he looked in the light. Athletic, lean, rolled sleeves at his elbows, kind eyes, the kind that don't ask, just wait. One night in July, she sat at the counter with her chin in her hand, laughing at something he'd said about an especially nosy customer. The warmth in her chest had nothing to do with the tea. He reached past her to grab a cloth, and she turned, without thinking, and kissed him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even much of a kiss, just the softest brush of her lips against the edge of his cheek, but it stopped time. Ezra froze, pulled back just a little. Marion blinked, stunned at herself, lips still parted. "Oh," she breathed. I didn't mean, I did, but not like—" He cleared his throat, stepped away gently. "It's all right," he said, his voice even. "You don't owe me anything." And then he walked into the back room. Marion stood alone for a long moment, staring at the spot he'd just been. Then, under her breath, she muttered, "Well, that went bloody well, Marion. Next time, why don't you just throw a pie at his head and save the embarrassment?" She clutched her apron, cheeks burning, then turned and stomped up the stairs, muttering all the way. The bell above the shop door had long stopped chiming. The store was closed. The moon hung low, painting silver stripes across the floorboards. Ezra stood behind the counter, wiping the same spot for the 4th time. He wasn't thinking about the ledgers, or the new shipment of Dickens novels, or the small stack of unpaid invoices by the till. He was thinking about her, about the way she'd laughed that evening, chin in hand, soft and unguarded, and about the way her lips had barely brushed his cheek. He could still feel it, like warmth pressed just under the skin. He'd pulled away, not because he didn't want it, because he wanted it too much. He didn't want her to mistake kindness for debt, didn't want her to think affection was something she owed him in exchange for shelter, or quiet understanding, or slices of pie left warm on the back shelf. Ezra ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. "She kissed you, you daft fool," he muttered to the dark, "and you ran like a bloody schoolboy." The floor creaked above, her footsteps. He didn't look up, didn't move, because if he did, he'd go to her, and if he went to her, he wouldn't stop. Not this time, and she deserved more than a moment taken in the dark. The next morning, the smell of cinnamon and flour was already thick in the little upstairs flat before the sun had fully risen. Marion stood at the counter, sleeves rolled, apron tied too tight, and a rolling pin clutched like it had personally insulted her mother. "Stupid," she muttered, pressing dough with unnecessary force, absolutely barking mad. "Who does that? Who just kisses someone over a joke about nosy customers? Who—" She slapped the dough once, then twice, then sighed. The room was still quiet except for the creak of old floorboards and the rustle of parchment paper. Outside, the streets hadn't yet filled with footsteps or carts, just the faint cry of a gull in the distance and the tick of the little brass clock by the stove. 25 pies. That's what she promised the cafe for the summer garden sale. It had sounded reasonable, sensible, a good distraction. Now it felt like penance. Flour dusted her sleeves. A smudge lined her cheekbone. Her hair was half pinned, half escaping. The kettle had already whistled twice and she hadn't poured a cup. She didn't trust her hands not to shake. She paused and glanced at the little window above the sink. From here, she could just barely see the edge of the bay where the water met the cobblestone pier. Boats were still, tied up and rocking gently. She watched them a beat too long. "Pull it together," she whispered to her reflection in the glass. He probably didn't even think about it, probably already forgot. And that made it worse. By the time she heard the bell chime downstairs, Marion had flour on her sleeves, dough on her elbow, and at least 8 pies cooling on the window ledge like a domestic fever dream. She froze, not at the sound of the door, at the sound of his voice. "Morning, Miss Jenkins," Ezra called up the stairs. Too polite, too neutral, like nothing had happened, like she hadn't tried to kiss him and then mumbled something about pastry assault. Marion closed her eyes, took a breath, brushed at her apron like it would help, then walked downstairs. Ezra was standing at the counter, sleeves rolled as always, sorting through a new stack of ledgers. He looked up the moment she entered, and then he smiled, warm, kind, easy, too easy. Marion felt the words tumble toward her throat, uninvited. Something about pies or receipts or moving to France and never showing her face again. But she said nothing. He beat her to it. "You've got flour on your nose." Her hand flew up. She swiped, missed, then swiped again. "Oh, of course I do." Ezra just kept smiling, not mockingly, not smug, just fond. He set the ledger down. "I was going to brew some tea. Want a cup?" She blinked. "Are we pretending it didn't happen?" she asked softly. Ezra's face didn't shift. "Only if you want to." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. She moved closer, boots soft against the wood. The kettle hissed low behind him. "I'm not sorry I tried," she said, voice steadier than she expected. "Only that it surprised you." Ezra didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned, poured the water, steeped the tea, no rush. When he handed her the cup, his fingers brushed hers. "I wasn't surprised," he said at last. "Just quiet, just real." Marion stared at the steam, then took a sip, burned her tongue slightly, said nothing. Ezra stepped back behind the counter, went right back to sorting receipts, as if nothing had happened, but he was smiling again. And her heart was too loud in her chest to argue with it. They didn't call it courtship. No one asked, no one labeled. It was just days stitched together by the quiet rhythm of the shop, the soft clink of teaspoons, and the way their glances seemed to find each other even when words didn't. Marion, for the first time in her life, felt like she wasn't being observed, just seen. She made pies in the mornings, 25 by Thursday, sold or reserved by name at the counter. Ezra stacked books, she brewed tea, he organized invoices, she read to the neighborhood children in the corner of the shop. Her voice strong and warm. Ezra smiled behind the register when she did voices. Sometimes he lingered in the doorway just to listen. At night they sat on the back step. She talked about things she never meant to say aloud. He listened like he'd been waiting to. One evening he reached over to brush flour off her cheek, and she leaned into the touch like it wasn't just an accident. But still, he didn't try anything, never took more than was offered. And Marion realized she'd never known how safe silence could feel, until now. The church bell rang 3 soft chimes over the village. Early light filtered through the lace curtains in the kitchen. Marion was elbow-deep in dough when Ezra came downstairs. He wasn't holding flowers, just a cup of her tea, 2 spoons of sugar, and a look in his eyes that said something had been decided. "Sit," he said quietly. She raised a brow, wiped her hands. Saturday, Ezra set the tea in front of her. Then, standing there in his sleeves, hair still a little damp from the wash basin, he said it. "I don't want to imagine my life without you in it. Not the shop, not the mornings, not anything. Marion Clark, will you be my wife? She stared at him, blinked once, then again, and then she said yes, just like that. Not with trembling, not with fireworks, but with something steadier. The kind of yes that comes from a soul that's already decided. He didn't reach for her. She did, her hand over his, her smile soft, her heart open. It was a gray Friday morning, the kind that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to rain or simply threaten it. The bakery across the road hadn't yet opened, and the street outside Ezra's shop was unusually still. Marion had just finished wiping down the display shelf when the bell over the door gave a sharp jingle. A man stepped in, drenched from the drizzle, hat in hand, spectacles fogged. His coat carried the smell of train soot and urgency. Ezra looked up from the ledger. Shop's not open just yet. I'm not here to buy, the man said, gaze settling on Marion. I'm looking for a Mrs. Marion Weatherby. She froze, her hands stilled on the rag. Her heart, steady moments ago, hitched against her ribs. I'm Marion, she said slowly. The man exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for weeks. Thank God. He stepped forward, reaching into his coat. From the inside pocket, he drew an envelope, thick, aged wax seal still intact. His fingers trembled slightly as he offered it. I've been searching for you for nearly 9 months, he said. Started in London, then Devon, even tried a boarding house in Hampshire. It was like you vanished. Marion blinked. I did, well, he continued. Jameson Weatherby made arrangements before his death, quietly but thoroughly. He instructed this be delivered to you, no one else, a letter, and a final will. Ezra stepped forward, his presence steady beside her but respectful. He didn't speak. The man nodded at the envelope. The date on this will, it's 3 weeks newer than the one currently being enforced. Marion took it with careful fingers, her throat tight. And the estate? She asked, barely above a whisper. The man met her eyes. All of Weatherby, the hall, the land, the accounts, everything is yours. Marion didn't cry. She didn't gasp or fall or clutch her chest. She just stared at the envelope for a long moment, then whispered, I knew he was many things, but I never thought he'd leave me empty. And then, quieter or full. Ezra watched her closely, unreadable, but his hand brushed hers beneath the counter, a quiet anchor in the rising tide. The wind was softer that morning, not warm, not quite spring, but it had stopped biting. Instead, it whispered through the hedgerows like it remembered her this time, like the house beyond the trees was no longer a stranger's home. Weatherby Hall rose in the distance, just as grand, but not as cold. Its chimneys puffed a gentler smoke, curtains open, garden gates unlatched, as if the estate itself had exhaled something it had been holding in for far too long. Ezra stood beside her at the edge of the gravel path, gloved hands resting on the reins of their cart. Well, he said, they didn't burn the place down. That's promising. Marion let out a breath. It almost passed for a laugh. She wasn't in morning black anymore. Today her coat was soft blue wool with polished silver buttons. Her gloves were simple brown leather, no veil, no apology, and no hesitation as she stepped forward. At the doors, Harris did not appear. Instead, a young woman, new housemaid, pushed them open with a practiced curtsy. Lady Weatherby, she said quietly, eyes wide. Mr. Cartwright, welcome home. Marion blinked. Home, not a place she was born to, not one she ever dreamed she'd return to with her head high and her heart full. But yes, home. Ezra looked around the grand entry, hands in his pockets. Big place, he said under his breath. Do you suppose it's got room for a second bookshop? She turned toward him. I was thinking 3. He smiled, that slow Ezra smile. Ambitious. Territorial, she replied. They walked the length of the corridor, his steps echoing beside hers. No one stared. No one whispered. Word had already spread, the rightful heir. The widow the world thought never existed, the one who never asked for power, only truth. At the drawing room, a small stack of boxes waited. One was labeled, for the village bookshop. Another, private correspondence, Jameson. Ezra lifted the top letter with careful fingers and held it out to her. Been waiting for this? Marion nodded once. She opened it slowly, paper trembling only slightly. Her late husband's hand flourished exact. Marion, if this is in your hands, it means what I feared came to pass. What I failed to give you in life, recognition, protection, the truth, I hope to give you now. I've left you everything, not to make up for what I did, but to free you from the weight of what I didn't. Burn this letter if you must, but know this, of everything I lost in life, you were the only thing I ever regretted letting go. She folded the letter with quiet hands, no tears, no trembling, just release. Ezra didn't ask what it said. He simply reached out, touched her fingers, and let her decide how long to hold on. There was a sign above the shop now, Cartwright and Clark, books, tea, and other escapes. Weatherby Hall's West Wing had been converted into a public reading room. The village children came in for jam scones. Locals borrowed paperbacks. A soft bell rang at the door, just like it had in the old shop. And upstairs, still above the shop, Marion woke every morning to the sound of Ezra boiling water and humming something she never quite recognized. One morning, she opened her eyes to find a note on her pillow. Just 2 words, written in Ezra's careful hand. Next chapter? She smiled, tucked the note under her sleeve, and headed downstairs to say yes.